Hello, horror fans. Welcome back to the Horror Trans podcast. This is a companion to the Horror Trans YouTube channel where I, a transgender woman, talk about all things horror. So, the podcast is a companion piece I do on Mondays. These are hour-long videos where I usually pick 3 or 4 topics to talk about, and I've got some topics today. I'm starting with something that's horror adjacent. It's not technically horror. It's not a movie. It's not a book. It's not a video game or anything of the sort. But it's in the horror family, in my opinion. As a horror fan, this was my preferred childhood game over some of the other ones like Tag or, I don't know, Hide and Seek, etc. Floor is Lava, whatever. And it's called Ghost in the Graveyard. So, Ghost in the Graveyard is a child's children's game, that's the word I was looking for, that is basically the reverse of hide and seek. So in hide and seek, you have the person who is it cover their eyes and count to a random number, 130, whatever number we all agree upon before we play. And everybody else runs and hides. And then the person who's it goes looking for those who are hiding. And then when they find them, they have to get back to the base before they get tagged by the it person or they're it in the next round. Pretty simple. Ghost in the Graveyard is basically the reverse of that. The way it works is you pick somebody, you have someone who's designated as the it person. This person is the ghost. And they run and hide. And then all the people stay at base. The players stay at base. And they count to 100. And then they go looking for the ghost. And whoever finds the ghost yells, "Ghost in the graveyard!" And then that person is safe. And then everyone else has to get back to base before the ghost catches them. Or become the ghost in the next round. As far as childhood games go, this is the one I think, from my memory, is the most like a horror game. I mean, the Floor is Lava has action-adventure elements, which are, sometimes intermixed with horror a little bit, but not too heavy. But Ghost in the Graveyard is one that I remember playing, especially as a horror fan, around Halloween time. We would play it the most. And, it worked best when you live in a small town of fewer than 100 people. So you got like 20 or so kids. The neighborhood kids all get together. And you have a whole town to explore. We were fortunate in that we lived in a trailer park out in the country. And there was a small town in Kansas that had less than 50 people in it. So they only had like 15 or so kids. So me and my sisters and my cousins and our friends would all get our parents to take us over there to play with our friends in this small town, just up the street. Too far to walk or ride your bike, but not very far of a drive. So it was like an afternoon, parents would hang out with the adults and drink beers and watch stupid movies while we would go out and play with the other kids. And this was a creepy town where there used to be a school in town, but the school burned down. So we liked to play Ghost in the Graveyard at the burned down school because this was an awesome place to play Ghost in the Graveyard. Fortunately for me, because I'm not very fast, because I was a fat kid too back in the day, I was never picked as the ghost, and I'm not very good at hiding. So I got lucky. I never got picked as the ghost. And I never strayed too far from base. I never went looking for the ghost. I would just sort of wander around, around the base area, the perimeter and such, until someone would yell "Ghost in the Graveyard," and I'd run straight back to base as fast as I could, to be safe. There's really not a lot to it. Sorry this isn't as much of a topic as I would have liked. But my next 2 topics are going to take up a little bit more time. So the second topic I have, this one could get meaty. And I want to talk about Gothic Horror, What prompted this was in one of my previous podcasts that I used to produce ages ago. I got into a Twitter argument with some asshole who was telling me that slasher movies weren't horror because they, quote, had no horror elements in them. And I couldn't get this asshole to tell me what horror elements were. And after poking and prodding for a while, I come to realize that this piece of shit was trying to assert that only Gothic horror counted as horror and everything else was not horror. It was either suspense or thriller or something else. And so eventually I got sick of arguing with this motherfucker and I just blocked him and told him to eat shit. But then I made a podcast topic trying to define what even is horror. So this is an extension of that. I'm going to do a deeper dive into various subgenres of horror. I have a whole list of the ones I want to talk about. And because I want this to be actually entertaining and informative, I've done some research. Because I myself had a surface level, very vague idea of what I thought Gothic horror was. Strictly based on a handful of references that I thought, okay, that's Gothic horror. But I didn't know what made it Gothic horror. And so I struggled with, how do you define Gothic horror? So I'm going to read a little bit from the Wikipedia article because this is where I did the bulk of my research, and I have watched some YouTube videos that I thought were fascinating on the topic, but I'm not going to link to them because I didn't bookmark them. And I delete my view history frequently because the algorithm is a piece of shit, and I don't want it recommend me stuff that's I'm not interested in, so I'm very picky about my homepage. I cater it. I'm very picky about my homepage. So, according to Wikipedia, Gothic horror is characterized by an environment of fear with the threat of supernatural elements and the intrusion of the past upon the present. Some examples would be settings like castles, religious buildings, and crypts. I would probably say, we were just talking about cemeteries, graveyards. I would say cemeteries is also a likely setting for these. And according to Wikipedia, again, just doing some surface level reading here, Gothic horror typically has like dreamlike elements, and death is obviously a common theme. And they typically take place at night. And they do have elements of suspense and mystery about them, murder mysteries, etc. So, when I was in college, film school, I did study film history. We didn't cover Gothic or horror. Well, we covered horror as a broad topic, but like we only hit the bullet points, you know? The examples were like the Universal Monster movies, and then the Hammer films, and then The Exorcist, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and then the slasher craze. And that was like as deep as we got, because it was only like a unit of one chapter. It wasn't a full deep dive into horror. We did a lot more in film noir, so I'm a lot more versed in film noir than I am, even though I'm a horror fan. From an academic standpoint, I'm more versed academically on film noir than I am anything else, because we did a whole study on noir for some reason. I think it had a lot to do with the lighting and the use of shadows, which I suspect was probably a theme from what I've observed in the early days of Gothic horror. You know, like the Universal monsters, I would say, are probably mostly Gothic horror. Maybe not all of them, but for sure Dracula and the Wolfman. I don't know about the Mummy or the Invisible Man. I've never seen them, and I know very little about either of them. But my understanding of Gothic is it's got two prominent elements that would classify it as Gothic. Element number one that I believe is absolutely essential is Gothic architecture. It has to have Gothic setting, a Gothic setting. This would be an old Catholic cathedral or a monastery. This would be something like a crypt, as I previously mentioned. This would be like, Dracula's castle, for example. An old European Gothic village, etc. most likely in the Gothic region of Europe, which would be around the Germanic settlements, you know, the Scandinavian countries and Germany, and places that the Germanic people had a heavy influence, including the British Isles, because that's where the Gothic language and people culture existed, and where the Gothic architecture comes from. There are a literal people called Goths. This was a I don't want to use the word race, an ethnicity of people. They had their own language, their own culture, their own bloodline, their own architecture, their own style, their own everything, their own society. And it's my understanding, and this only comes from linguistics because I took courses in linguistics in college. From a linguistics standpoint, it's my understanding, I could be wrong here, but from what I remember, the Gothic people as a whole were either bred out of existence, as in they integrated into the other broader European cultures that they came in contact with, or through some historical event that I don't recall reading about, may have gone extinct. I don't know if there was a war or if they were conquered or what. There are a lot of, we'll say native, I don't know if native is the correct word, but tribal people who inhabited the British Isles before the you know the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans and everyone else got there, the Vikings, etc. And some of those people are classified as extinct as well, either through integration, inbreeding, etc., or they just were conquered and they don't exist anymore. One example that I think a lot of people know about are the Picts from Scotland. But I digress. The second element that I believe is essential to Gothic horror is a supernatural element, but not necessarily demonic elements or even fae elements. I think it's more specifically ghosts and undead spirits. And I think spirits is the key here, because the theme is the past intruding on the present. And I think that requires the presence of, vampires would qualify because they live long lives. I would probably say werewolves because they can live long lives. Definitely ghosts and banshees would probably qualify, I would suspect. But I think banshees are more of a Scottish, Irish thing. So I don't know if they would count as Gothic or not, because I don't think there were any Gothic people in Scotland or Ireland, to my knowledge, ever. Or at least while they were still a coherent people group. Again, I'm not a historian, so if I'm getting anything wrong, please don't, fuss at me. Just feel free to correct me with sources, not just, comments. But if you have sources, correct me. I would love to learn more. But I'm going based on what I know, and what I know is mostly from what I read in college and browsing some Wikipedia articles and watching some YouTube videos, which the YouTubers I am not sourcing because there wasn't much agreement among YouTubers. I get the sense that a lot of people are confused about what Gothic horror is, and so they make up their own definitions. And I'm not satisfied, personally, with the Wikipedia definition, because I feel like it's too vague, I mean, supernatural elements in Gothic architecture can be found just about anywhere in the world. And I don't know if that's enough to classify something as Gothic horror. Now, when I was a child, I went through a goth phase in high school that my Baptist parents quickly stamped out of me because they thought I was a devil worshiper and they didn't want nothing to do with it. Obviously, I'm wearing black right now. I wear a lot of black. I still have vestiges of the traces of that Gothic desire, that phase of my life. Obviously, I'm into horror, and I am a chaos witch as a pagan, so, this obviously appeals to me. I think Gothic horror, in particular, is a lot like horror in general. It's one of those, I hate to say this, use this turn of phrase, but it's one of those you know it when you see it, but it's really hard to describe it. It's one of those, you can point to Dracula and say, that's Gothic horror. But I'm not going to call From Dusk Till Dawn or The Lost Boys Gothic horror. So just the existence of vampires alone isn't enough. Or even just Eastern European vampires isn't enough. There has to be more to it than that. I think it's more about the feel of the movie. You know, just like noir. Noir is an aesthetic. It's a very specific aesthetic, but it's also a tone. And I think that Gothic horror has to have that old world tone to it. So for me, I think there should be some build up. So we're not talking about fast moving stories or, you know, movies or stories with tremendous amounts of action in them. I would say they can have some action in them, but most likely reserved for the climax or just sporadically throughout. I think it would have to have, tonally, it would be more like a, you know, more suspense than anything. And I think there must be some sort of intrigue. Intrigue is hard to define, but there has to be something that compels the characters to investigate the supernatural forces, because they likely recognize doing so, they're putting themselves in danger. So this would be something like discovering that the, you know, I don't know, the old tree in the backyard at the edge of the cemetery is haunted because somebody was hanged on that tree and burned at the stake or something. And so their spirit lies in unrest at that tree. And then so like an example would be The Conjuring. Conjuring to me is not Gothic horror in the strictest sense. And again, I don't think just being supernatural is enough to classify something as Gothic. But tonally, I think tonally, not aesthetically, but tonally, The Conjuring is close, in my opinion, to Gothic horror. Even though it's modern, I think it has that, you know, the old world coming back. Not the old world, like the European world, but, you know, the 1800s and such. So there's still the past coming and intruding upon the present. And there's a tremendous amount of intrigue and supernatural elements. But we're not dealing with Gothic architecture or imagery. So I would not go so far as to say, yeah, The Conjuring, that's Gothic horror. No, it's not. But that would be, you know, an example of tonally something that would fit the bill. The problem I have with that definition is, again, it's too broad and it's too easy to say, well, then, you know, Beetlejuice is Gothic. I wouldn't make a case for that. But, you know, maybe you could make a case for Tim Burton's The Headless Horseman, or whatever it's called. What's that? The movie with the Headless Horseman called? I can't remember off the top of my head. Sleepy Hollow, is that what it's called? You could almost make a case for Sleepy Hollow as Gothic horror. Tonally and aesthetically, I think it's close. It's very close. But not close enough for my tastes. I think it's not exact, but it's close enough. I'd say, yeah, close enough. Especially if we're gonna call Frankenstein Gothic horror, because I believe Frankenstein, if it fits the bill, then I don't see why Sleepy Hollow can't. And by the way, I don't really have an answer for you. I don't think I am qualified to define what Gothic horror is. I just wanted to have a discussion. And to do that, I wanted to share my limited knowledge on the subject and see if I could plug the holes in my knowledge and find out more, you know? Because when I look at a list of what is widely regarded as Gothic horror, frankly, I'm going to be honest, I don't see a lot of works I recognize on that list. And that leads me to believe either Gothic horror has generally, in the broader sense, died down, or it's not an aesthetic that appeals to me much because I haven't investigated it much. So let's go back to the Wikipedia article and see if I can find some movies. Let's see, other media. This article is mostly about novels, but it does bring up the Castlevania video game series as Gothic fiction, as well as the video game Ghosts and Goblins and Dungeons and Dragons Adventure Ravenloft, which I would agree with Ravenloft. Absolutely. I mean, it's basically Dracula, as is Castlevania. And then the rest of these I either don't agree with or I'm not 100% sure about because I've never played these games. And I'm not seeing movies. So let's see if there's an article of Gothic film. Here we go. A Gothic film is a film that is based on Gothic literature or contains Gothic elements, since various definite film genres, including science fiction, film noir, thriller, and comedy, have used Gothic elements. The Gothic film is challenging to define clearly as a genre. We're only interested in Gothic horror, so let's see if I can find notable films. And again, it's the same fucking list. Some of them I would agree with, some of them I'm fishy on. Nosferatu, I would say yes. Dracula, for sure. Frankenstein, I'm going to put an asterisk on. I'm not convinced Frankenstein is Gothic, but you can convince me. The Pit and the Pendulum, again, I'm not convinced that one is, but you could convince me. Rosemary's Baby, I would argue isn't, and you're not going to convince me otherwise. Suspiria from 1977, I watched that movie. No, that's a firm no. I do not believe that is Gothic horror at all. And then we have The Orphanage, which I've never even fucking heard of. The fact that Wikipedia only has 10 films on its list of examples of Gothic horror, and none of them are clear-cut examples, in my estimation, I feel like it is harder to define than I originally anticipated, which is, in and of itself, frustrating. Because as I'm reading the article, it's even saying in the article, some argue this example is Gothic, others would say it's more Lovecraftian or Eldritch, which things get a little fucking fuzzy. Also, not on the list, but in the article, it mentions, where did it go? Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which, if that's an example of Gothic horror, then Lethal Weapon is Gothic horror. And I'm sorry, but I don't think so. So, I feel like Gothic is too broad. And then there's also Gothic romance film, which is like, oh my god, we're really getting into the weeds here, and I don't want to go that deep into this for a podcast. So, I'm going to say I don't have a clear definition of Gothic horror, and I'm not comfortable enough with the examples as presented to me to be able to say I can find the connection. I don't see anything at all in Rosemary's Baby that is related to Dracula at all. To me, those are as different as night and day. So I don't know how you could stretch Rosemary's Baby to be Gothic if you're using Dracula as the template. So maybe I'm missing something, and that's kind of the point. I just don't know. The fact that I didn't find any significant contemporary examples leads me, probably erroneously, to believe that the idea or concept of Gothic horror is probably outdated, and it's probably, as a term, been supplanted by something else. And and I have a theory on that, but I'm not going to get into it in this video because I want you to come back and watch my other videos. But also because I got to do some more research on that other subgenre that I'm still digging into, and I want to do more research on that one because I'm even fuzzier on it than I was Gothic. At the very least, I had an academic understanding of Gothic architecture because I took a art history class in college, and I took a linguistics class, so I had at least an understanding of the language and the people that spoke it and wrote using it. So I was a little more prepared for this video, as unprepared as I am, than I will be for the next video, because my research has led me down some rabbit holes that is really pissing me off. And I'm starting to wonder if horror fans can agree on anything. We can't even agree on if Jurassic Park is horror or not. So, if we can't even agree on that, I don't see how we can agree on what is or isn't Gothic. That's just me. Moving on, the next topic I want to get into, again, I probably should have had a fourth topic for this episode because I don't feel like I can do this one much justice. But I'm going to talk about it anyways. And it's a film adaptation of A Nightmare on Elm Street for television known as Freddy's Nightmares. So, I've talked about at length how A Nightmare on Elm Street is my favorite film of all time. Not Gothic, by the way. Not even at all. And, so when I was a kid, and we're just going back to my childhood, I was obsessed with Freddy Krueger, to the point where I would try to dress up like him, not just for Halloween, but just to go to school. I had a red and green striped sweater. I had a glove that wasn't the Freddy glove, but it didn't have fingers. It was one of those weird gloves, that didn't have the fingers. So I would stick pencils in the finger holes and pretend I had a Freddy glove, but that's not important for this discussion. And so I was very obsessed with A Nightmare on Elm Street and Freddy Krueger. As such, when I learned that there was a TV show known as Freddy's Nightmares, I was obsessed with it. Now, I lived in small town, rural Kansas in the 80s. So we did not have cable TV. We did not have satellite TV, because satellite was different in the 80s than it was in the 90s. This was before Prime Star, which was itself before DirecTV and Dish Network. So when I say satellite, I'm talking about a gigantic dish in your backyard that you had to manually point at individual satellites to get different channels, and you still had to subscribe to those channels through whatever service you got. It was a fucking nightmare. Satellite TV was not what it is today. So we didn't have satellite because also it was fucking expensive back then. Prime Star made it affordable, and then Prime Star disappeared and was replaced by DirecTV and Dish Network. So there's your background. But back in the day, all we had were the channels we could get over the air. And because we lived way out in the country, in rural Kansas, we could get exactly 4 channels. The 3 networks, affiliates, and the PBS, the local PBS station. Now, the PBS station would never air anything that resembled Freddy's Nightmares. And since Freddy's Nightmare, well, I say the 3 broadcast networks. Fox did come along, but you have to remember, Fox as a network didn't start until like 1988, 1989, I believe. So when Freddy's Nightmares was on TV, Fox didn't exist yet. It wasn't even a concept yet. It didn't exist yet. So we weren't even there yet. Come on, people. The 80s was a lot longer ago than you realize. And we've advanced way faster than we sometimes remember. Anyways, Freddy's Nightmares was syndicated. So it would come on TV late nights on weekends, Friday nights or Saturday nights. Usually I would say Saturday nights if my memory serves me correctly. And it probably would have most likely been CBS at the time. In our market. I don't know where it would have been in your market. And I remember during the Halloween season, during the month of October, they would air Freddy's Nightmares pretty regularly. And then it would just sort of disappear after that. Now, I'm sure they kept airing it, but it was one of those, they promoted it during the Halloween season and then they just sort of left it to flounder the rest of the year. Is how I remember it. Again, we're talking, I was like 6, 7 years old. So come on, my memories are going to be fuzzy. So don't at me, please. This is just how I remember it, which is very vague. Now, Freddy's Nightmares, I did pick up a VHS tape with a couple episodes off eBay a long ass time ago just to check it out. And I was able to get a hold of a pirate copy once upon a time that were VHS rips. And the show does exist on Tubi, where you can watch episodes for free with commercial interruption. But again, those look like VHS rips as well. So this is a hard show to watch because a couple of reasons. One, the acting and the writing is atrocious. So you're talking about a show that isn't really worth a shit. This isn't like grade A TV, okay? We're talking about a really crappy show based on a B movie, more or less. A great B movie, but still a horror movie. Not a top-notch movie. It's my favorite movie of all time, don't get me wrong, but come on. Also, Freddy's Nightmares came along after the MTV. Freddy had been firmly established as the more popular iteration of Freddy Krueger. So Freddy's Nightmares features a very goofy MTV-like Freddy versus the darker Freddy from 1 and 2 that some people hold as the Holy Freddy. So again, this show may not even appeal to you at all for that reason. Again, the other thing that makes watching this show god-awful is the fact that the picture quality is atrocious. It's very hard to watch. Even if the picture quality was great, which it ain't, it would still be hard to watch because the special effects and the set dressings are god-awful. This is fucking no-budget TV. This is a TV show that probably borrowed unused sets that, other shows used, and they would just dress up at night when the other shows weren't in production, is my guess. Just based on the look of it. Either that or it was filmed in somebody's fucking basement, like the show within a show on Wayne's World. Just fucking somebody's, I don't know. This show looks very fucking low budget. Now, eventually, I will talk about the companion to Freddy's Nightmares, which is Friday the 13th, the series, which I did watch more of, because that one got a bigger push from the networks that aired it than Freddy's Nightmares did. And I don't quite know why. I have a theory, but I don't know if it's worth investigating without doing some research first, because I could be way off. But I remember not only seeing promos regularly for the Friday the 13th series, I remember watching it regularly with my parents, and it was on during the time people are at home watching TV, whereas Freddy's Nightmares was late night TV on the weekend. You had to look for it, and you're not going to be able to stay up until 3 a.m. as a kid every Saturday, especially when you got religious parents like mine who are pushing your ass to church on Sunday morning. So, my personal experiences with Freddy's Nightmares are very vague. So, I am not, by any stretch of the imagination, an authority on this TV show. The most I know about its production and history and behind the scenes, I learned from watching Never Sleep Again, the Elm Street documentary, which is fantastic, by the way, and also can be found on Tubi. So, check it out. If you want to learn more about Freddy's Nightmares, that's your go-to source. And it's also a good source for all things Freddy Krueger. So there you go. I don't really know what else to say about this, other than I have not seen full episodes at all, because, like I said, they're hard to watch. And I don't just mean the picture quality. They're hard to watch. They're fucking painful. They're so awful. They're not worth it to me. So, I really wish I had more to say about this because we're at the 35-minute mark and I want this to be an hour-long podcast. And I didn't plan ahead. So I'm just going to look at my show notes and see if there's another topic I can pick up real quick. And try to wing it because I don't want to leave you hanging. And I don't want to do another TV show. So since I mentioned it already, let me go ahead and put Ravenloft on the planner. And let's talk about Dungeons and Dragons Ravenloft and Strahd. Strahd von Zarovich, I believe it's called. Alright. So let's go ahead and shift over to Dungeons and Dragons Ravenloft. Now this one I can talk a little bit more about because I have some more experience with Ravenloft. I do not own any of the advanced Dungeons and Dragons modules. No, first edition or second edition stuff on Ravenloft. Nothing. But I do own Curse of Strahd from 5th edition D&D. And I have thumbed through it a couple of times. So I'm at least familiar with it. I have watched in-depth reviews on YouTube of Ravenloft 1 and 2. And I have, browsed eBay looking for Ravenloft modules to eventually add to my collection, which I have not done yet because they're out of my price range for the most part. I have to be very selective about buying retro D&D stuff because I can't buy too much of it all at once because it's very expensive. So Ravenloft is a D&D, an AD&D adventure module that is more or less a recreation of the Dracula mythos. Ravenloft exists in its own little realm, which is separate from the main D&D world. So you can put Ravenloft anywhere in any D&D campaign. And it has at the center of it a castle, and in the castle is a vampire lord named Count Strahd von Zarovich, I believe is his name. We just call him Strahd. It's easier. Count Strahd. He's more or less Dracula. I am not familiar enough with the story, the backstory of Ravenloft to be able to get into it too detailed, but it's my understanding that it's pretty much Dracula. There was a woman that he and his, I believe, brother was fighting over. They were both in love with her, or she was married to one, but the other one wanted her, and she died, and he becomes a vampire to resurrect her, I believe is my understanding of it. And so the adventurers encounter some traveling wanderers who has a sage in their midst, who reads from a Taroka deck and sets them on their way to free the village of the corrupt overlord, the vampire overlord, so that they can go live their lives peacefully. And so you explore the dungeon, the castle, and you look for monsters to encounter, and you uncover pieces of the history and lore, and eventually you encounter Count Strahd. I have to check this text real quick, just in case it's my boss, because she likes to text me to come to work. And I have to make sure it isn't her. And it isn't. So, Ravenloft was fairly successful to my understanding. It sold a lot, and it influenced D&D enough that in 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, Ravenloft expanded from just a pair of modules, Ravenloft and Ravenloft 2, and eventually it became its own campaign setting, its own world. And that's where we are with 5th edition Curse of Strahd. I believe there's more. I believe there's other books out there in the Ravenloft setting in 5th edition, but I don't currently own them. And I don't know much about the books I don't own because I only research the books I buy. Because those are the ones I'm interested in. And again, 5th edition books are themselves kind of pricey. So I don't have a massive D&D collection. However, I have played campaigns in the Ravenloft setting, and I have played campaigns that borrow heavily from Ravenloft. So I think I can at least talk about it a little bit. And I think the overlying theme of Ravenloft is it's sort of the official D&D horror setting. And it's also the go-to horror setting for horror campaigns in Dungeons and Dragons. And I say the go-to because there are obviously others. Any good dungeon master can craft their own horror setting. And I've played a D&D game set in the Diablo setting, which was also horror, and a very fun campaign that I had to leave for reasons I don't want to talk about. So, as a horror fan, Dungeons and Dragons definitely does appeal to me in that regards. I also enjoy fantasy and science fiction, and Dungeons and Dragons is very much fantasy, and it has trace elements of science fiction as well. So, it's right up my alley. I would argue all Dungeons and Dragons campaigns are horror campaigns. And the reason why I say that is because in every D&D campaign I've ever experienced, you're always in a dungeon, usually a crypt or something similar, a series of caves, or the basement dungeon area of a castle, which is a horror setting. And you're always, regardless of D&D campaign, fighting monsters. And more often than not, you are, because you likely have a cleric in your party, fighting undead monsters. And death is around every corner in Dungeons and Dragons, which is very much horror. So, for me personally, I don't really believe that Dungeons and Dragons needs a quote, official horror setting, because any D&D campaign can be classified as horror. I mean, fuck, going into a cave and encountering a beholder is the fucking climax of a horror movie. And every D&D video game I've ever played has skeletons and zombies in it, and usually werewolves or were-rats. Were-rats tend to be more popular in the video games than werewolves for some reason, and I don't quite understand why that is. But that is what it is. So, I mean, yeah, I know D&D is more fantasy, and some nerds argue it's high fantasy, but we're not getting into the variations of fantasy right now. And no, I'm not going to say Lord of the Rings is horror, because come on. It's not even horror adjacent. It has trace elements at best, and that's not enough for it to be horror in my book. And there's nothing scary about the Lord of the Rings. Considering nobody in the party fucking dies, there's no stakes in Lord of the Rings, but I digress. I'm not a fan of the Lord of the Rings, by the way, if you haven't noticed. I've never played a D&D campaign in my life. I'm 41 years old. I've been playing D&D since I was 12 years old. I've never once played a D&D campaign where at least one or more of the party members didn't die. Death is a part of D&D. It's so much a part of D&D that it's expected in most campaigns that you're probably going to die at some point. To the point where most players I've played with usually have a backup character at the ready just in case their current character dies. I usually have a backup character just in case. In fact, I've got 6 of them on D&D Beyond, ready to go at a moment's notice, just in case I can plug them into any campaign. Ready to go. Because I don't mind character... Tangent. I don't mind character creation, depending on which edition of D&D I'm playing. But if, somebody invites me to a 3.5 edition D&D group, I'm going to make goddamn sure that character don't fucking die, because I ain't going through the 3-hour process of making another one. That's my beef with 3.5 edition. It takes too goddamn long to make a character. But I digress. First edition, 5th edition, it's like 10 minutes, you're in, you're out, you're done, you're ready to go, you're playing the game. And Ravenloft, as we're talking about, started in 1st edition. So it was easy to get into. You know, this was before the days of Wizards of the Coast, who would eventually buy TSR. Well, and then get bought out by Hasbro, but that's a whole nother topic. This is before the days of pre-published modules coming with pre-generated characters. They do that now, but they didn't back then. Back then, you still had to go into the module with your own characters. And a lot of times, it was up to the dungeon master to fill in the blanks. They still had to name the NPCs. In some cases, flesh out the NPCs. All you got was a paragraph description and a stat block. So it was up to the dungeon master to fill in the rest. And a lot of times, it was up to the dungeon master to populate the blank map that came in the back of the book. So old school D&D was a lot more open-ended than modern D&D. Modern D&D is pretty much paint by numbers. You know, it's like, here's the book. It's a complete module. It's ready to play out of the box. So, that being said, going back to Ravenloft, I do have Curse of Strahd, and I haven't played it yet. And one of the reasons why I haven't played it yet is I don't have a group to play with. But the other reason I haven't played it yet is, even though it is sort of a modern retelling of the classic Ravenloft, I personally would still like to play the original Ravenloft before I play Curse of Strahd. And I have reasons for that, that I don't want to get into here. The other thing about Ravenloft I want to talk about is the Taroka deck. So, in the class, it's my understanding, in the classic D&D campaign module, it was up to the dungeon master to either provide a deck of cards and have the representations of the individual cards correspond to cards in the module, or use a tarot deck and likewise do the same thing, assign a representation to the card. Modern D&D, or at least 5th edition, Hasbro actually produces a Taroka deck, an officially licensed Taroka deck that you can buy yourself. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because the Taroka deck, the 5th edition Taroka deck, is an item I eventually want to add to my collection. I'm a fan of trading cards and playing card games. I collect trading cards and playing card games, as well as tarot cards. I have 2 tarot decks. I am a witch, a pagan witch, so I do read tarot from time to time. I have other forms of divination that are more effective than tarot, I believe, in my opinion, in my experience. So I reserve tarot for specific things, but I don't want to talk about that here. The last thing I want to talk about in regards to Ravenloft is the cultural insensitivity of the original module, whereas they refer to the Romani people by a racial slur that I am not going to say. And it is heavily referenced and used throughout the book. And because that is a racial slur, I am hesitant to play the original Ravenloft. I still want to, but obviously I would just avoid using that term altogether. But it's worth mentioning because it was published at a time where we were less sensitive to cultural stereotypes than we are today. And if you've ever read anything at all about the plight and history of the Romani people, you would understand why it is extremely insensitive to refer to them by that name. On the flip side of that, one could make a case that it is imperfect representation of that cultural group. Although I would argue it's more stereotype than representation. As you know, as a transgender queer woman, I can recognize and appreciate um, failed attempts at representation or imperfect attempts at representation, so long as they're not blatantly offensive. But it's complicated because, you know, we're disparaged enough as it is. And I'm going to get nasty comments on this video because I get nasty comments on all my fucking videos because I'm a trans woman. So I don't want to stretch this any longer because I'm not going to get into the history of the development of the Ravenloft campaign setting and adventure module because I'm not going to pull up the Wikipedia article, and my knowledge of it is very fuzzy because I've only watched a couple of YouTube videos on it, and I don't think I could accurately recall the information in those YouTube videos well enough to be able to do them justice. So you'll just have to do your own research there. Which isn't something I typically get into on this channel. Now, I will say this much. Ravenloft is one of the official D&D campaign settings that I personally do collect. I collect Greyhawk and Forgotten Realms and Ravenloft and Dark Sun stuff. Those are the 4 official campaign settings that I do buy campaign books and modules and things of in those settings. Those are, to me, those are my 4 of the official campaign settings. Those are the 4 I recognize. And so Ravenloft is one that does definitely appeal to me, especially as a horror fan. No, sidebar, Out of the Abyss is just as much horror as Ravenloft is. And I believe Out of the Abyss is Forgotten Realms. So like I said, just your core D&D can be horror in its own right. And that's my show for today. So just some housekeeping. As a reminder, I am not doing Horror Trans reviews for the rest of the month of December. I'm only doing the podcast on Mondays. And I'm doing 2 horror icons a week. I'll do one on the weekend, and I'll do one on Wednesdays. So today's Monday, so you got two days to wait for my next horror icon. And I am doing, once a week, I'm doing a Patreon video where I watch a horror movie and commentate on it with my friend Gavi from the internet. Gavi is not a horror fan at all. So if you're interested in listening to 2 people watch a movie and talk about it, you got one who is a diehard horror fan and one who absolutely hates horror movies. So you're getting 2 perspectives, 2 opposing perspectives on the individual horror movies as we're watching them. So if you're interested in that, go to patreon.com/Stephanie Bree. That's StephanieBri, Bree spelled with an I, and check that out. It's only $1 a month. Come on, $1. And you can listen, you can watch along, you can watch the movie yourself, get it on DVD or whatever, and listen to me and my friend talk about it. We just did Sorority Babes in the Slimeball Bolorama, which I accidentally checked public on, and I'm not going to reverse that because people are watching it. So, you know, there you go. Merry holidays. Happy holidays. So, freebie, I guess. My mistake, but, you know, have at it. And I've done other horror movies. I was doing non-horror movies, or attempting to, but then I realized I was sitting there watching the movie with nothing to say, because if I'm going to sit there and watch Mean Girls, I'm not really commentating. I'm just enjoying the show. Also because there's not a lot to commentate on Mean Girls. It's such a great fucking movie. How am I going to riff on a movie I love? We're not, I want to put this out there. We are not Riff Traps, and we are not Mystery Science Theater 3000, so we're not comedians riffing on the movies. We're just 2 casual movie fans, well, a casual fan and a diehard fan, watching movies and talking about them from our perspectives, our limited perspectives. So we're not like ripping them apart, we're just observing, and we're talking about what we observe. That's everything for this week, so stay cool.